One moment, please, Your Worship.
All right, thank
Does
you.
that mean we need 3 for it to, like, what happens if there's 5? Like, if there's 6 of us and 3 vote in favor, it gets defeated, right?
Yeah.
But if there's 5 of us,
3 vote in favor.
We're good to go, Your Worship.
All right, thank you, Ms. Rousseau. All right, we have quorum, so I'd like to call this committee of the whole meeting for March 10th, 2022 to order with adoption of the agenda. And I want the agenda to be adopted as amended to remove all in-camera items. So if someone want to make that motion for me, Councillor Charlotte, seconded by Councillor Brooks Hill. All in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you. Adoption of the minutes from the February 10th, 2022 meeting. Committee of the whole. Councillor Charlotte, seconded by Councillor Brooks Hill. All in favor? Motion's carried. Any business arising from those committee of the whole minutes for February 10th? Seeing none, we are going to move on to item 9A, staff reports, planning and dealing with council referral to committee of the whole, KOA Campground. So, Mr. Simon, do you have a bit of a report that you would like to do?
To Your Worship, no prepared presentation, but just as a reminder, this is a request from the owner under the Real Estate Development Marketing Act to change a portion of the campground to a shared interest model, or a cooperative interest model rather, where people would be able to purchase a portion or an interest in the company to secure a portion of the site for their intended use, so they can bring their RV on, operate as is at the campground, but you'd essentially be privatizing a portion of the site to specific owners, and it would be removing it from availability for the traveling public to come and ultimately rent a site. So when this was originally presented to council, it was ultimately requested that it be brought to the March Committee of the Whole meeting for further discussion. So I'm happy to answer any questions that council may have.
Okay. Councilor Palmer.
Excuse me, Mayor Sulz, I'd like to put a motion that council defer that the request to consider the conversion of the ownership model be deferred until after the completion of the OCP review.
Okay, so there's a seconder for that motion. Councilor Ryan, did you put your hand up? Any discussion on that motion?
So I'll speak to the motion. Yeah, so this is outside of sort of normal stuff, and I have a lot of hesitation anyway. I think this really probably belongs in a rezoning or OCP amendment or something like that. I'm not comfortable making any decisions around a change of ownership model. I have a number of concerns, but probably more importantly, I think it can detract from that number one priority of the OCP review that we established. So I just don't think right now is the appropriate time to be considering a sort of unusual request. So that's the purpose behind the motion.
Okay, so just out of clarity for council's benefit, because you're deferring that to OCP review, is there any
after the OCP?
Oh, after the OCP review, is there any further discussion, Mr. Matusi? Just clarification of that.
No, I think I think just push it. No, I don't really want to deal with it.
Yeah, we just don't.
Okay, all right. So, Councilor Pursuant.
So I know I received an email from the proponent, and I was just looking at it again, and I was wondering if everyone wants to, because it was only addressed to me, I realized.
No.
yes,
Yeah.
Also saw that.
Everyone got that. Yeah.
And, you know, it's interesting what the idea behind it, but yeah, I agree with Councillor Palmer that it's kind of unusual and it doesn't feel the same as most council decisions. I don't. So
now that we've got a motion on the table to defer, we're not going to discuss it further until it's deferred. Okay?
Okay, right.
So now I need to call the question.
Is that because of the nature of the
procedural thing, that's correct, yeah. So
okay. All right. So all those in favor? Opposed? The Councillor Sherlock is opposed. The motion is carried. Thank you. All right, so now we are going to move on to short-term rental zoning amendments report. Mr. Simon.
Thank you, Your Worship. Again, we don't have a formal presentation for this, but this is based on a resolution that Council had passed on January 25th, 2022, outlining further discussion on items 6 through 10 from Councillor Ryan's resolution that she had brought forward with respect to some specific parameters around how we can regulate short-term rentals. So staff have gone and reviewed some of those specific provisions and provided an overview as well as some of the potential implications to help facilitate council discussion. If there's any questions on any of the specific items, staff are here and happy to answer. Thank you.
Okay. Councillor Ryan?
Hi.
Oh,
I didn't have my hand up.
I thought you had your hand up. I'm sorry. So.
Just out of habit.
No, I thought you had your hand up, so I apologize. Is it council? Any questions or comments for Mr. Simon? Councillor Charlotte.
In the first item, when we're talking about the adding to the bylaw rule, the restricting the advertising to require a valid business license. Sorry. It looks, the staff mentioned speaking with online accommodation platforms, but I'm curious as to whether we've spoken with the province on where they think they're going to go with this. To me, this topic feeds into a lot of the other points that if we had the accommodation platforms on board with us to help us do this thing automated through tech, all of a sudden a lot of these things become possible because it's not a human having to comb through the data to do the work, right? So if we had support from the province to push the accommodations platforms, I know they're not going to offer to do it out of the goodness of their heart, but if the province pushes them for that, that then opens up a lot of doors here, I see. So with planning going on for SOGA right now and UDCM, I'm wondering if this fits into that conversation beyond where we decide to go, but to push this to make some more things possible. I'd like to
and you know, I'll just be matter of fact, I think getting anything onto SOGA at this point in time it is beyond.
And I'm not expecting us to put anything on, but I'm curious, there might be already something going.
Well, yeah, and that's something that we can ask when we get there, sort of thing. But that doesn't mean that we can't have conversation with our colleagues around the table regarding that. Do you want any follow-up before I go to Councillor?
No.
Okay, Councillor.
Yeah, so my understanding is that host compliance does offer this. So even though Airbnb wouldn't be able to tell you that you can't list there because you don't have a business license, host compliance can scan it, be like, oh yeah, this person doesn't have a license, flag it in host compliant, like our host compliance platform. And then it can even go so far as to be like, okay, it will look up that license number, relay it to a database where the license numbers are issued to specific dates. So if we have that like 30-day thing, for example, exactly. And then like highlight it red, like this listing is not compliant.
Right.
So I think the tools are all there.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
Okay. Any comment on that, Mr. Simon?
Through worship, no, Councillor Rind has it exactly right, is my understanding of the host compliance software, which is what staff would ultimately envision to be using. And it's just a matter of the capacity to be able to review all those that don't have valid business licenses. So this was always envisioned to be a requirement in the business licensing bylaw. That's the appropriate location for it. So no additional feedback on this particular item within the resolution.
All right, thank you. We'll move on to, like Nelson has done, create a new license that will allow 30-day rentals once a year for residents going on holidays. And limit the number of licenses like this that can be issued per year to 100 or some other reasonable number. No property shall request more than one of these licenses per year. Any comments, Councillor Ryan?
Yeah, so this is a similar comment to my previous one about how if it's used correctly, host compliance can provide that visibility, and I can understand the staff concern about capacity, but in some of the initial research that is available publicly, or Googling or YouTubing kind of like host compliance and how it works, you can see various municipalities show you how, I'm going to say simple because of course nothing is simple and there's a learning curve to any kind of new platform, but if the appropriate staff member is like trained properly, once things are set up, it can be very straightforward. And if there's really active enforcement at the front end, it ends up, you know, creating a lot less work down the road because people know the city's not messing around. So I agree that for sure there's an element of capacity that has to be part of the consideration, but I don't agree that this is, you know, as much of a task as like having to hire an entire new person to do this kind of thing.
Right, Councillor Sherlock.
Yeah, to follow up that, I completely agree. I think with the right support, the right business plan, the business case, so that cost of that, if it is a whatever capacity that role would be, so a certain number of hours looking through listings of non-compliant properties and dealing with those through a process that can be documented of how long this takes, that should be able to get worked into a business plan for the budget with the business license fees. Because that's how we juggle those around, was how I was understanding it. And further to that, I think having a conversation around investing in the staff capacity to do this kind of work is an important part of what we need to do. I think there's been enough comments around see, click, fix and the tools that we use that they are not properly supported by staff because staff just don't have the capacity. We haven't put a budget line item for this kind of work. And I think it's important that we do that so that we can move forward more strategically on it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, any other comments on this portion? Councillor Brooks.
Just that I support it. I think it's a good initiative.
Okay. Any comment from staff, Mr. Simon, at this point?
Through your worship, so we had detailed it in the staff report. Again, I think it's a good conversation about operational capacity and the impact that it has on the work that's already being done within the Development Services and Bylaw Enforcement Group through corporate administration. One of the things to note, there are circumstances where it might not be necessary to bring a very robust regulatory process to something where if someone's away for 2 weeks on vacation and they're like, oh, I want to rent out my house or I want to do a house share program for 3 weeks of the year, that's not necessarily something that requires a business license. So we tried to expand upon that in the report. One thing that I do note for staff, we look at intent of use, right? If someone is intending to operate a short-term rental on a permanent basis and they're intending to operate it as a business, then most definitely a business license is required. If it's a one-off situation that is not intended to be done on a permanent basis, then they're kind of falling within those gray areas of the zoning bylaw. So it's kind of a case-by-case basis, and staff really do look at that intent to use. So one thing to consider whether or not this needs to be embedded in bylaw. It's something that as we do move forward, we do want to bring forward a policy for council consideration where you get a little bit more flexibility in a policy to help with interpretation. This is something that could potentially be a good fit within that policy as well. So something for council to consider.
Good, well, I appreciate that input, but now we've sparked up council. Have comments. Go Councillor Ryan, Councillor Sherlock, and Councillor Brooks.
I was just gonna say that in that case of somebody doing a house swap or having their family here, in my mind at least, it would be quite different in the sense that that person is not advertising their property on like host compliant, or sorry, on Airbnb or on VRBO or any of those sites. So it's a bit different. But I can understand how the wording in the bylaw might be a little tricky.
And, you know, and I think Mr. Simon's comment is, you know, the less we have to worry about bylaw going out to enforce these sort of things where mom and dad are going to rent their house out for 30 days or 2 weeks or whatever, and everything's copacetic as far as that being done. I get where he's coming from. That makes total sense. So I'm going to go to Councillor Sherlock and back to you, Councillor Brooks. Okay?
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, it's an interesting conversation. I'm looking at, this is something that I see more of a long-term phased-in process. This is not something that, at least I'm not pushing to have this happen this year or right away. But I agree with Councillor Ryan that in that, I think what we're talking about more is that advertising requirements, that bylaw being you cannot advertise. So that it's not so much about the house swapping part. That's not a business, because this is what we're looking at, is operating a business out of your home. And this would, if citizens really want that opportunity to be able to advertise this in their home for a max of up to 30 days, then it's it fits in with the compliance of the other operations, because it would just get flagged as anything else.
Right.
But it gives them that opportunity to be able to advertise it versus just doing house swaps. From what I understand, Airbnb makes it really easy to be able to share your home and make a little bit of extra cash on it. So this would be a way to offer that as that mortgage helper for a short-term, small-time use. But I am really curious to see what could it look like in policy that might very well be enough, and then slowly phase in what works for the community.
Perfect. Thank you. Councillor Marshall?
Yeah, just echoing my two other councillors. I see it not being embedded in the bylaw, and exactly that. This isn't trying to capture those, I guess, less formal arrangements where, oh, I'm going to go away for a month and my friend is going to come and stay at my house while I'm there to look after it. That's not a business, but it's when you're actually like monetizing it, advertising it, and say hiring a property management company to look after it. That would be what this is.
Good as well.
Yeah.
Very good. Thanks. Councillor Palmer and then Councillor.
Yeah, question to Mr. Simon. Currently, and maybe this was answered already and I missed it, but currently, if there's a homeowner out there that wants to rent their house for a month or two on a month-by-month basis, is there anything that prohibits renting out their house? And is there anything that they have to do with the city in order to do that legally?
Through your worship to Councillor Palmer, if it would be not classified as short-term, so 30 days or greater than 30 days, then they would just be considered boarding and lodging. And technically, when you're renting out more than 2 rooms, you would require a business license for that. We do have that in our business licensing bylaw.
Right. And so just further, so then if there's somebody that goes south for 30 days or 35 days every year, maybe in November or whatever, December, a month, and they have a habit of doing that every year, and they rent it out for 1 month, is there anything that would prohibit in that case?
Through your worship, no, that would just be considered a long-term rental. It's when they're getting below that 30-day mark is when they get classified as a short-term rental.
And if that person to rent out for that period of time advertised on Airbnb, would there be in any breach of any regulations?
Through your worship, no. Again, assuming that individual had a valid business license for boarding and lodging, then they would be fully in compliance with city regulations. And that's one of it's an important point, I think, where there's a variety of advertisements on Airbnb and other similar booking platforms that aren't always short-term. There are long-term rentals and hotel advertisements on there as well.
Thank you.
And so one of the tools, I sound like a spokesperson for host compliance. I swear I don't know. I swear they're not paying me to be here.
It's part of our t-shirt.
Yeah. But one of the features on there is to give staff the ability to mark certain places so they don't continuously come up, because a place like that, for example, would initially get flagged for being on there without a business license, and then it would be up to it would show up, and then staff would go out and be like, oh, but it clearly states a minimum of 30 days, and you literally cannot book it for less than that, so they can flag it as like not an issue.
Yeah, and if I may just respond to that, I am supportive of the city using host compliance as an appropriate tool as needed. And I think that just provides some clarity around that.
Okay. All right. So, Councillor Sherlock.
Just back to the host compliance part, since those other operations would still have a business license for each of those different uses, in theory, they could still put their business license into Airbnb. It'd just be a different kind of license. It's not a short-term rental license, but like a hotel has a hotel business license.
Yeah.
And a boarding and a lodging house would have a lodging business license. So it still doesn't negate the ability of them to put a license number in.
Yeah.
Licenses.
Right.
Some don't have a boarding license.
Somebody may not, but or may, and I don't know. I mean, I guess I don't have the business license stats. Mr. Simon, do we have people in the community that have boarding room licenses?
Through your worship, we would have to pull those specific stats. I guess I can say, given the rental situation within the city right now, it would not be a huge priority for our bylaw enforcement to go knocking on doors to make sure that everyone has a boarding and lodging license. But when you look through the business licensing bylaw, off the top of my head, I do believe it says boarding and lodging constitutes more than 2 bedrooms being rented out, and then that's when the business license requirement would kick in.
Thanks for the clarity. I appreciate that. Okay, any further comments on this that's on there? Councilor Ryan, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I was just gonna skip to number 4. Well, I mean, if we want to talk about it through Buchanan, it just seems pretty straightforward that.
So go to number 4 and then basically, so spot zoning, just for the public, spot zoning is already in the zoning bylaw. So let's just move on to 4.
Yeah, so about the density, that's kind of where I was seeing that the interactive online tool would come into play to give people a good idea of kind of what their likelihood is that they could get a license. And I understand the concern that staff has outlined in the report that different neighborhoods have different densities, but I think maybe less on a block by block, but more maybe like a neighborhood, or I don't know what's in between a block and a neighborhood, but some, you know, outline can be made where, depending on the general density in that area, you assign a reasonable percentage of that area to be Airbnbs, and that to be pretty clear so that people can know when they're on that tool, like I live in this area and 10% or 5% or whatever it is allowed for Airbnb. So I'm not sure like the exact details of how it would work, but I know that Nelson does this in that they only allow a few per block, and they have that kind of online interactive tool. And so if they're able to do it, I don't think the distribution of density is that different.
Okay.
I'm sure they have similar challenges, I guess.
Any other comments from councilors? And, you know, with what we've already got on the books and got the neighborhoods, I'm not supportive of this density thing. So that's just my opinion. Any other comments from council?
So what's the reasoning, sorry?
Well, you're talking about, so you're adding a density restriction. Are you talking about within the areas that we're talking about for short-term rentals, or your intention across the community?
Well, yeah, this intention was not with the current proposal. It was assuming that it's not going to be restricted to the 59 properties in the current proposal.
Okay, so anyway, so I'll stand by that comment. Councilor Pursuant.
I agree with you. If we were looking at doing the whole community, I would be in support of this.
Okay.
That's not what we're looking at right now.
Any other comments, Councilor? Councilor Shaw?
Yeah, I think I'm on board with that, where if over time we do look at expanding short-term rentals into other residential neighborhoods, I would want to look at some sort of a density restriction. Hopefully by that point, we will be more comfortable with the technology and the tools at our disposal, and that if something like this was possible, then we could put in place those conditions so that that would be part of that future bylaw or amendments in the later to add it to other residential neighborhoods. But for now, with the areas that we do have as it stands, I agree that this is not yet as helpful as it would be in the other areas.
All right, any other comments? Okay, let's move on to item number 5. Increase business license costs substantially, ensure the revenue generated covers all enforcement, similar to Nelson. Basically, this option is up to council. So what do you guys think, Councilor Shaw?
Like I was saying earlier, I think it's really important that we have a solid business case of what this looks like on the ground so that we properly resource it for enforcement. I think that the learning curve will probably be pretty steep, and that it should be someone's wheelhouse to monitor and interact with this level of data. This is the kind of thing I nerd out on a little bit, so I'm kind of excited about what the potential is if we resource it properly, the potential for that to help with other city operations, and especially with customer service, where we know what property is tied to what business license, and all this data can get at our fingertips rather than having to hunt it out.
Okay, so I need some clarity for staff on this sort of thing. So, you know, how do you feel about, do we say, here's a dollar figure, or is this something that we deal with in the business licenses? And I know that a couple of councillors want to speak, but Mr. Simon, I'm just going to go to you for a little input from a staff perspective.
Through your worship, I don't think we have to land on a dollar figure today. Essentially what the plan will be, council did pass a resolution on January 25th that directed staff to bring forward a report with enforcement options, and we'll have some different figures in there based on existing business licenses. And, if those business licenses were to double as people are coming into compliance and understanding the rules, or triple, and we increase fees to X amount, how much revenue that would ultimately generate for the city. And then there will be kind of costs outlined for, if there is an impact on enforcement, what that would ultimately take. So I don't think we have to land on a dollar figure today, but I think that staff are getting the understanding from council, and it's something we've heard from the community as well, that this fee is expected to cover the services that are required to monitor and evaluate it. So, and I can tell you, like host compliance, it's about 15 grand a year. We already know that fee. There obviously will be bylaw enforcement implications as well, and we have to talk about how those get phased in and the resource implications associated with that. So I think we can get into some specifics of the numbers at a separate time with respect to fee increases.
Great, thank you for that clarity. So Councillor Burchill, then Councillor Palmer.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, well, not as in depth, but essentially that I don't think that today we need to get into the details, but I'm in favor of sort of the full cost recovery model. And obviously we won't be able to project that probably beforehand, but as well as we can. And then
Good.
we adjust it.
Appreciate that. Councillor Palmer.
Motion, possibly just further to some of that dialogue, that the committee of the whole recommends to council that the business license costs and fees be reviewed in conjunction with the fees and charges bylaw, a future fees and charges bylaw review.
Okay, second for that motion. Councillor Charlotte, any further discussion, Councillor?
Yeah, I just want to make sure, like, that's not the only motion that's on the table. Well, I mean, right now, obviously it is, but are we going to talk about like next steps as well and potentially make another motion?
We could, Councillor Palmer.
So what I was hearing from Mr. Simon is we've already given staff the direction on the mechanisms, and this is just ensuring that we review the actual fees.
Right, but we had the public hearing, and I'm just curious when we're going to have the discussion about next steps. Because
so
in my
next
mind, that was supposed to happen today, but I want to make sure that.
So next steps, so because we have this motion on the table, let's deal with this motion and then we can talk about next steps. So let's talk about.
But this motion and what comes from it will depend on what option we do with the whole bylaw, right?
In what way?
Well, depending on this framework that we adopt, there will be different requirements for how it gets enforced.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so that report's going to come to council anyway as to what our options are. That's what Mr. Simon.
But how can they know the options if they don't know the framework?
Because we've already given them instructions as far as what we wanted to see come to council. Have we not, Mr. Simon?
Through your worship, so I might be able to provide some clarity on timing if that's okay with respect to the main short-term rental bylaws.
Go ahead, please.
We would anticipate March 22nd for formal council consideration of third reading of those bylaws. With respect to the enforcement options, the general options that are available at council's disposal, they will be comparable depending on the, I guess, regardless of the actual outcome that comes from that third reading consideration. So if further changes are directed to the short-term rental bylaw, the mechanisms by which we go about enforcing the regulations won't change too much. Resource implications could change depending on the scope of how expansive we want the short-term rental regulations to go, but the actual procedures to enforce and implement using things like host compliance won't change too much, I would say.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and then I guess just to clarify then, so the decision about third reading will come forward to council, and there's nothing that we should be discussing at committee of the whole to sort of premise that if there are any suggested changes?
And we can, Mr. Simon, you were gonna comment before I interrupted.
Yeah, through your worship, the changes that, or the resolution that was referred back to committee of the whole here, staff views them really largely as amendments that could potentially influence business license bylaw or, future policy that would come into place to talk about how we review, implement, and evaluate the short-term rental regulations. We have to be very, very careful because the public hearing is closed for the short-term rental regulations and we can't be presenting or discussing any new information. So I just think it's important to note that the scope of the discussion today in staff's view really does more so align with business license bylaw changes, as well as future items to include in a council policy to give staff direction on how we review, implement, evaluate, and monitor the short-term rental regulations within the city.
Great, thanks for that clarification. All right. So the motion on the table is, just refresh my memory.
That the committee of the whole recommends that council review the business license costs and fees in conjunction with a future fees and charges bylaw review.
Perfect, thank you for that. Okay, I'm gonna call the question. All those in favor? Opposed? This motion is carried. Thank you. Any further discussion? I see nothing further in the reports dealing with the business license short-term rental discussion paper. Anything else, Mr. Simon, that we should deal with other than what we see here?
Through your worship, no, but I can just say in general, staff had chatted with colleagues over at Nelson, and I think it's important that we learn from other municipalities, but we also make sure that we come forward with solutions and approaches that are suitable for Revelstoke. There's definitely some different distinguishing features between Nelson and Revelstoke, and I think the scope of or the volume of short-term rental applications we can anticipate here will far exceed what they have within Nelson. So very important to learn from other municipalities, but also make sure that we're adapting our strategies to be suitable for our city.
Good. All right, thank you. Okay, appreciate that. Okay, let's move on to RCMP fourth quarter report. Any comments on the report or any questions? Seeing none, I think we're going to move on. I appreciate the fact that we get the report from Sergeant Dodds, but I see no questions. I have no questions. It seems pretty straightforward. I appreciate what the RCMP is doing in our community. All right, I'm going to move on to moving in camera. I'd like to move in camera pursuant to section 90.1E of the community charter. Someone want to make that motion for me?
I thought we were having a special council meeting.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's right. Thank you for that.
I move that motion to adjourn.
Move, terminate the meeting. Moved by Councillor Palmer, seconded by Councillor Charlotte. All in favor? Thank you. Thank you for that clarity. Can't blame it on anything but old age, guys.